Bill Oneil was appointed to the state historian of the Texas by then Governor Rick Perry. And is during his 6-year tenure in that position, he traveled all over the state of Texas, speaking on behalf of Texas history. And he is past president and fellow of both East Texas and the West Texas Association of Historical Associations, and has been a member of the Texas State Historical Association for over half a century. Bill is author of more than 50 books. He was awarded the A.C. Green Literary Award 2015 from the West Texas Book Festival in Abilene, Texas. In 2012, Bill received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Wild West Historical Association. Isn't that a good one? And in 2007, he was named True West Magazine's Best Living Non-Fiction Writer. His account of Wyoming's Johnson County War won him the Book of the Year award. Bill has appeared in TV documentaries on TBS, the Historical Channel, the Learning Channel, CMT, A&E, and the American Heroes Channel, and during his long tenure at Panola Junior College. His most prestigious teaching award was the Piper Professor that was presented to him in 2000. I spent a lot of time in higher education. I want you to know, folks, the Piper Award is a very prestigious award, honoring your president and your abilities. In 2013, Panola's new dormitory was named the Bill Oneil Hall. Now, folks, when you get your name on a college institution, you done good. Very good. And in that same year, he received an honorary doctorate of letters degree from his alma mater, Texas A&M Commerce. Bill has 4 daughters who have all entered the field of education, and he is a proud grandfather of 7 grandchildren. We've had the privilege of having Bill as our keynote speaker before, and I know you will really enjoy your time being here today. So Bill, come and share with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, David. My initials are the same as Pilgrim's. I'm Bill Oneil, B.O. I'm glad you didn't shortcut me. Thank you very much for the kind words. I'm delighted to get a chance to be with you again, particularly to talk about this guy. He has resonated with audiences, golly, all over the state, and it's a pleasure to get to talk about him with you. And in fact, I asked Dr. Edwards if it would be all right if at the end of the program, and I really will keep this to a minute, considering the nature of the organization, I thought it might be appropriate for me to at least mention a little list of the various museums that I went to put this book together. Well, John Salmon Ford, Rip, as he often was called. Rip Ford was a Texian, and that was the term he preferred. He was a Texian of many parts. He was a Renaissance man of the 19th century Lone Star, arriving in Texas just after the Battle of San Jacinto. During the next 6 decades, he lived into his 80s. Ford was a physician, an attorney, a journalist. He was part owner and outspoken editor of several Texas newspapers. He was a frontier surveyor at a time when that was pretty risky business. He was a legislator and statesman of both the Republic and of the state of Texas. He was a Sunday school teacher in both San Augustine and years later in Austin. He was the mayor of both Austin in 1854 and 20 years later of Brownsville. Both times he was elected in absentia. He wasn't anywhere near, and he got home a year later now. He was the innovative superintendent of the Texas School for the Deaf. He helped blaze a trail to California through the harsh Big Bend country, and of course, Rip was a celebrated military figure. His Ford ancestors arrived in the Plymouth colony in 1621 aboard the merchant ship Fortune. Of course, that was just 1 year after the Pilgrims had arrived on the Mayflower. The Fords moved south, and Major John Ford, his grandfather, during the Revolution, he suffered multiple bullet holes in his uniform, those big old loose coats they used to wear at the Siege of Savannah and at the Wilderness Battle of Camden. Ford's great-grandmother knew Francis Marion. Francis Marion would earn fame in the Revolution as the Swamp Fox. And if you've seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, that's who Mel was playing. Didn't call him that, but that's who the character was. And then Grandma also knew, as a young lady, tall, muscular George Washington. She said he was the finest looking man I ever saw. I think she was crushing on him, you know. In 1776, during the Revolution, a war party raided a rural community in South Carolina and brutally murdered Rip's great-grandparents. They stuck flintlock gun muzzles to their temples and blew their brains out with these huge exit wounds during a shootout in a store that was being plundered by British Tories and a war party. Rip's grandfather, George Selman, was shot through the torso by a warrior. Treatment at that time called, what are they going to do for a stomach wound? They got a silk handkerchief, soaked it in whiskey, took a ramrod, stuffed it in, and did that. And Ford's grandpa recovered. Asked why he reported these grisly stories from his family's past, Ford stated with pride, when one comes from fighting stock, he has a right to be proud of it. Fighting stock. That would become a hallmark of Rip Ford. John Salmon Ford was born May 26, 1815 in South Carolina. There was an older sister, Betsy. William and Harriet Salmon Ford, their parents, took their little family to Lincoln County, Tennessee. If you remember, Tennessee is a long, kind of rectangular thing, and this county is right down at the bottom. It borders Mississippi, a wilderness area, and they had a farm, and on that farm, young John Ford was taught to ride, and later he would be a tireless rider, and then also to shoot. And he would become a pistolier nonpareil, I assure you. But on that farm, young John Ford not only taught to ride and shoot, he was taught, and he put his tongue in cheek, I think, when he said this, the art of tilling the soil. Like a couple of other farm boys of that era, Abe Lincoln and Sam Houston, John Salmon Ford was turned off by the drudgery and repetition of farming, and like Abe and Sam, John Salmon Ford became captivated by reading. At the one-room log caddy school that he attended, John Salmon read every book in the place, including everything privately owned by the teacher. By the time he was 16, he was reading medicine the way frontier people used to read for the law. And he did that in a physician's office, Dr. James Barksdale, in Shelbyville, the seat of the county just to the north. And for an agreed upon fee, this was the deal, he poured through Dr. Barksdale's medical dictionary and his medical textbooks, and he assisted the doctor with treatment techniques in the office and on house calls, learning his craft. He also had a youthful romance with Mary Davis, and the couple wed in Shelbyville on November 24, 1835. I stress that date. The bride was 14 and the groom was 20. She had something funny going on at her house, and so anyway, she hurried into message. Man, besides, 14 wasn't that unusual in those days. But soon, Dr. Ford became excited about the Texas Revolution, and he tried to raise a company of volunteers for what he called the New Land of Promise. When news of Sam Houston's triumph at San Jacinto arrived, young Dr. Ford realized, well, they don't need my company anymore, but he was all charged up about it, and he decided to go to Texas anyway. GTT, gone to Texas. He packed his medicines that he had mixed himself, rudimentary medical equipment, personal belongings, and Dr. Ford took a southbound steamboat on the Mississippi River all the way to the mouth of the Red River. Then he kind of doubled back, went upriver on the Red on another riverboat before disembarking, and as he wrote about it, he did a lot of autobiography work. There are 14, I should mention, there are 14 of his notebooks in the Texas State Archives about himself. And he said with the last of his money, he purchased a wagon and team for an overland journey to Texas. A ferry boat took him across the Sabine River Then there was a journey of several more miles, all this in the middle of the night. He reached St. Augustine, went through the residential section on the eastern part, and then he reached the square. And he had already tied a sign to his wagon, John Salmon Ford Doctor, and when he camped in his little wagon, and when the people woke up the next morning, they found that they had a new physician. And his medical practice thrived. He was very good at it, and he watched his charges, and somehow, while he was doing that, Mary Ford, I don't even know where she got any money, she somehow made her way to St. Augustine. In 1840, the couple had twins, but they were boy and girl. And Boy Ford, and that's the only name they ever assigned him, Boy Ford died immediately. Fanny Ford, however, did survive, and she would become his oldest child. But Dr. Ford reminisced that his marriage to Mary, quote, gradually fell apart. And it fell apart because he wasn't interested in the thing. I'm not suggesting infidelities, but he was busy with all kinds of stuff. They divorced in St. Augustine in 1841, and Mary returned to Tennessee with little Fanny. In Tennessee, Ford's mother died at 53 in 1845. Within a few years, his father, William Ford, decided to join his increasingly prominent son in Texas, and through circumstances unknown, somehow he got the granddaughter and brought Fanny to Texas, and that's where she would spend the rest of her life. And her daddy hadn't seen her since she was an infant. Dr. Ford, meanwhile, is enjoying an active social life in St. Augustine. He came to know Sam Houston, who had a law office there. J.P. Henderson is going to become the first governor of the state of Texas. Thomas J. Rusk, incredibly prominent man. Owen Roberts, who's another future governor, and he knew veterans of San Jacinto, signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence, and he was an inquisitive man, and he pumped all these guys all the time. He joined the Masonic Lodge. He taught a boys' Sunday school class. He wrote 2 plays for the local Thespian Corps, amateur theatricals. And during the Regulator-Moderator War, Dr. Ford witnessed a brutal murder at a revival service happening out in front of him. In 1844 and 45, Ford served in the Republic of Texas Senate in Washington on the Brazos. Well, there he met, and he became the 4th husband of a charming widow named Louisa Swisher. Charming, I mean, she had 4 husbands. And less than a year after their 1845 marriage, and I got from a museum, yay for museums. This is their Republic of Texas, it's a photocopy, of course, of their Republic of Texas marriage license. It's good for 30 days. And it's handwritten, and it's really good. They provided me with that at the Texas Ranger Museum in Waco. And I took it happily, and I show it off all the time. So anyway, she fell ill, and within a year of their marriage, she passed away. And he dropped everything he was doing and returned to medical work, tried to nurse her back to health, and it didn't work. And when she died, she was 34, Rip was 30. She was buried at the new cemetery in Austin, Oakwood Cemetery, out on a hill northeast of Austin. And he got a little plot there. Remember, he'd been a surveyor. He put little blocks down, and he would later have to bury his father there, who died of old age, and his son, who died in his teens, tragically. I'll mention that before we quit. I always stay at the Doubletree, or I try to, because I park, and then I step right across this little bit low fence, and I'm in that cemetery. And one of the first graves I come to is Ben Thompson. Some of you know my affinity for gunfighters, and Ben is buried there. But anyway, at this point, war had been declared between the United States and Mexico. While in St. Augustine, Rip had joined several militia companies every time there was an Indian scare. There was never any action, as it turned out, but they would march around a little bit and drill some and spend a couple of nights in tents and so forth. And he was bitten by the military bug. He was doing newspaper work at that point in Austin. And this Texas Ranger Regiment was training to help invade Mexico in San Antonio. He went down to interview him, and he goes from camp to camp, and he can't stand it. He just joins right then. And Private Ford becomes first lieutenant for the next day because Jack Hayes, the colonel, finds out about this guy who's got some sort of education, and he all of a sudden he's a private and then he's a lieutenant. Thus, Ford's military career was launched, and for the next 20 years, he would ride forth to battle the enemies of Texas. And that included Mexican soldados and bandidos, especially in this war with Mexico coming up, and Comanche warriors, especially throughout the 1850s, and then, of course, in the 1860s, Yankee invaders. At this stage of their existence, Texas Rangers, and I took the rest I could hear, my badge is still on. Texas Rangers were frontier protectors rather than law enforcement. The law enforcement part that made them so famous would not come until well after the Civil War. And all of this took place at the same time as a revolutionary technological development. When the Spanish arrived in Texas in the 1700s, they had these little muzzle-loading muskets. Took them a minute or so to reload, and they wouldn't shoot but about 60 yards. And the Comanches were horseback Indians, and they had a repeating weapon they could fire from horseback, which was a bow and arrow. And however many arrows you had in your quiver, you could fire that many times because they handled their horses with their legs and knees. And so, the Spanish would fire a volley from those muskets, and here would come the Comanches. And while they're trying to reload, they just fill them full of arrows. When the Anglo settlers turned up, we had rifles, and we could therefore keep them at bay somewhat. Our rifles had a distance of perhaps 150 yards. But we still weren't able to do any good. The key was a repeating weapon that you could fire from horseback. And at this period, Sam Colt, whose father was an industrialist at Patterson, New Jersey. Patterson, New Jersey, there's a great big, wonderful museum there. There's waterfalls all over the place, and it turned the power wheels of the factories of that day. And so Mr. Colt let his son, Sam, diddle around with this revolving pistol idea, and he finally came up with a 5-shooter, a small gun, and it didn't have much range. It was 28 caliber or 31 caliber, but his daddy loaned him tools and equipment and men, and pretty soon he's got this 5-shooter. Now you had to take it all apart to reload. It was very awkward to reload, but Captain Jack Hayes, a couple of years before the war with Mexico, in 1844, Captain Jack Hayes heard about this gun, and he got some. He had a small company of men riding out of San Antonio into the hills after the horseback warriors. And he got these 15 men. He got a couple of 5-shooters for each man, and he trained them, and he didn't want to shoot them at the same time. He wanted one gun at a time. That's 5 rounds, holster it, pull the next one. They also had a shoulder gun. And he went hunting Comanches. And he found a group of 70 plus warriors. And they did their usual thing. They hung up at a distance, and our guys fired their rifles and emptied some saddles, and then here came the Indians. Well, our guys then charged. Now this is happening west of San Antonio. Our guys charged. Drew had drawn one pistol, and Hayes said, "Powder burn 'em, boys." That was part of the training. It's hard to hit something when you're galloping on a horse. And so he told his guys to get right up against them, and they did. And they emptied about 30 saddles. 15 guys outnumbered 70 to 15, and they killed about 30 of the enemy and shot others with those little bitty balls that they had. This triggered there were a number of these fights in 1844, and at this point, Jack Hayes becomes very, very famous. He sent another famous ranger, his chief lieutenant, Captain Sam Walker, to New York to find Colt. And he wanted all kinds of improvements in these guns. And they were a much larger gun, 44, 45 caliber, something that would knock an Indian out of the saddle. It would be big enough to have 6 rounds instead of 5, and that gave you 12 rounds, plus your shoulder gun. That's 13 rounds without reloading. There were several other features to this, but without getting into the plow grip handle and the loader and so forth. All of a sudden, they march off to Mexico, and they have 13 rounds without reloading. And again, I stress, they didn't fire 2 guns at the same time. that fired a shoulder gun, and then six more. And we see these action movies today, they have machine guns and everything like that. But these guys had 13 rounds without reloading, and thus they had more firepower than any soldier in the world. And they kept working, Sam Colt kept working on that gun, and he improved it to where he called his final model the Walker Colt. And the Walker Colt was, he called it the Texas model. It weighed 5 pounds, loaded, great big cartridges. And boy, that thing was something. And Rip Ford took these over. He loved it. He was very proficient with those things. At this point, the American force assembles at Veracruz on Mexico's eastern coast, and they will march between 250 and 300 miles into the interior of Mexico and fight in Mexico City. And Colonel Hayes assigns Lieutenant Ford to lead a 50-man scout company into the jungles because they were being attacked by guerrillas. Ford constantly spoke with West Pointers. This is the first war we ever have in which West Pointers are prominent and numerous. He assembled an impressive military library. Every time a new weapon comes up or a new model of a weapon, there are weapons manuals. He got tactics handbooks from the Army. He got military treatises of every sort. A governor of Texas came to his home in Austin after the war and looked and said, "My goodness, you've got the finest military library in Texas." Remember, he's a book guy. Well, they fought their way into Mexico City. They saw Chapultepec Castle from the halls of Montezuma. They saw Chapultepec Castle and also downtown, the National Cathedral. These, to me, are the two best tourist attractions in Mexico City still today, I think. And on one occasion, they were fighting an Indian group, and the Jefe was some distance away conducting kind of a rear guard action himself on foot, darting around. Rip Ford pulled this great huge hog leg of his, 5 pounds, and he aimed, and bam, with one shot, he knocked the Indian down. He was hit in the left arm with the first shot, open sights. The ranger beside him had a rifle, and he finished the guy off. They measured off the shot. It was 125 yards. 125 yards is a football field, plus both end zones, plus an additional 5 yards. That's an incredible shot with those old kind of guns. Well, that's what this guy was capable of. And by the way, they took the weapons and so forth from this chief and sent them to the governor, and they were on display in our best museum of the time, and that was the state capitol that sadly burned in 1881 and took those things up. Sam Walker sadly was killed in these actions and shot in the head. And then Captain Jack Hayes, when they got back to Texas, he decided he would go to California, Gold Rush, and indeed he went out there and became prominent and wealthy. But that meant that with Walker dead and Hayes gone, Rip Ford was the most prominent Texas Ranger leader in the state. And of course, we're a state now. And so throughout the 1850s, without going into detail, Captain Ford fought war parties and border raiders. He fought against one treasured enemy was Juan Cortina, the Rio Grande Robin Hood. He met and came to greatly respect a young cavalry officer named Robert E. Lee, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. He was assigned on one occasion to go up instead of across the Rio Grande. He's going to take a 100-man force, and his father enlisted. He was 71. You see where the guy gets his sense of adventure. And they go upward all the way to the Canadian River, and they found one Indian village after another. And on May 12, 1858, had an attack, and they charged every single village, and then got the heck out of there. Got back to Texas, crossed the Red River, and they were feted for this successful expedition in a barbecue at Stephenville. And when they got back to Austin, feted again. They had killed 76 Comanches that they found laying on the ground. One Texan was killed. There were 60 captives, hundreds of horses, lances, shields, bow and arrow. One of the great exploits that he had. But that brings me to this. He favored, the tactic he favored was headlong charges. He was very aggressive. And Texas horses, Indian horses were grass-fed. Texas horses were grain-fed, bigger, heavier, and he loved to attack them, full headlong charges, and try to turn their flank. During all of this, he led the charges. And he lost a finger. One time he had a finger shot off. He got a scalp wound, bled all over the place, and gave him a concussion. He wasn't right for several days. And he was once struck with a poisoned arrow that had been poisoned with rattlesnake venom by Indians. So I put a chapter in the book called "And Rip Smote the Enemies of Texas." Rip Ford, Captain Ford, Colonel Ford, to me could be compared to the great warrior kings of the Bible. He was said to read the Bible every day because his mother had made that request on her deathbed. And he carried by with it, read it every day, and he would have been drawn to the combative stories involving King Saul and David, Joshua and Gideon, Samson battling his enemies with the jawbone of an ass. In Ford's case, the jawbone was a couple of big old hog-leg Walker colts. He wasn't, I don't know how much of the warm and fuzzy stuff that stuck with him, but he was a warrior king. He absorbed the battle narratives of the biblical warriors who were protecting God's chosen people. And in the case of Ford, he interpreted chosen people as Texians of that era. And we were very vulnerable, had a plethora of enemies. And he was protecting them, as the biblical warrior kings did, from armies of pagans and barbarians. The pagans and barbarians were war parties and border raiders and so forth. And that was a motivating factor for this guy. As the Civil War approached in 1861, Rip Ford rode as marshal of a secessionist parade in Austin. Even though he owned no slaves, never wanted to own slaves, was not interested in agriculture at all, but somebody loaned him a big white stallion and said, "We need you to lead this parade." And he certainly did not want Yankees telling him what to do. He didn't want anybody telling him what to do. And in fact, you may not know this, but in the census of 1860, 76% of all Texans did not own slaves. A lot of them wanted to, but they just didn't. And his 20-year-old daughter, Fanny, also rode in that parade. Ford married for the third time in 1861, right before the war started. She was Adeline Smith of Brownsville. She was the redheaded daughter of a merchant, and she was 21. Ford was about to turn 45, but he was a big, trim, impressive-looking guy, and of course, he was the hero of the day. He was known to everybody in Texas. And so they got married at the Presbyterian Church of Brownsville. They had 2 daughters during the Civil War and a son right after the war, just kind of regular. And later they adopted yet another daughter. And she would graduate from San Antonio High School later on. At the beginning of the war, Ford was appointed a colonel of cavalry of the Texas Army, as we called it. And his outfit, the 2nd Texas Cavalry Regiment, was stationed in the lower Rio Grande Valley. He was commander of the military district of the Rio Grande. One interesting thing that happened down there, Colonel Ford helped 2 old friends, ranchers Richard King Ranch, and Mifflin Kennedy. And they were trying to ship cotton from the Confederacy past the Yankee blockade. And he came up with a ruse that allowed them to fly the Mexican flag. He arranged the whole thing with the government, and they flew the flag on their steamboats. King became a really fast friend, and later on helped Ford financially. Then, during the mid-1860s, Ford served as director of the Texas Bureau of Conscription. There was an unpopular draft law. In that census of 1860 that I mentioned, we had 92,000 men, ages 17 to about 45. And over 70,000 of them served. Just about everybody in Texas served who could. And so we did not like the Confederate government telling us, "More, you gotta go." And he organized recruit training at Camp Ford. And what was the original title of that?
The Eastern Camp of Instruction.
Eastern Camp of Instruction. And of course, it's called Camp Ford today. And as you probably know, after they trained for a while, all of a sudden it began to be utilized as a POW camp and became the largest prisoner of war camp west of Mississippi. Then later, in 1864, with federal troops having seized Brownsville and the lower Rio Grande and blockaded cotton traffic crucial to the South, while Ford is elsewhere, he was asked to form a cavalry force to win back the lower Rio Grande. From San Antonio, Ford issued an appeal for volunteers. And boy, manpower was getting short at that point. And you were lucky if you could perhaps raise 300 men for a regiment. Rip Ford wants my services. 1,800 men responded within a very few days. Colonel Ford called them the Cavalry of the West. He paraded this oversized regiment at the Alamo Plaza, and as they rode past the Alamo, he ordered eyes left. And this is their jumping off spot. They're looking right at the Alamo as they go south to invade the enemy. Without going into the campaign, he and his men rolled the Yankees back from their positions along the Rio Grande. One thing to say about that, here would be Fort Brown and Brownsville and Matamoros, and then 20 miles later is the mouth of the Rio Grande. There are sandbars down there, and the Yankees had fortified a position with cannons, but they won't dislodge this guy. This guy dislodges them, and they retreat to this place, and the pent-up cotton trade rebounded, and Brownsville and Matamoros became boomtowns as cotton was briskly exchanged for wagon loads of rifles and medical supplies and gold. But by the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was on its last legs. General Lee surrendered his army in April, but below Brownsville, Colonel Theodore Barrett, a federal officer, he decided to march his troops back up to Fort Brown, in part to bolster his non-existent combat record for purposes after the war. Confederate General James E. Slaughter, in nominal command down there, he had heard from scouts and spies, and so he announces to Rip Ford that night that the Federals will advance the next morning and that Texas forces should surrender. And Ford looked at him, surrender? He said, "You can retreat and go to hell if you wish. These are my men, and I'm going to fight." And he sent couriers out all night. By the next day, he had a mixed force of artillery, infantry, and cavalry, and he marched out a few miles from Brownsville to a plateau that's called Palmetto Hill. And when the Union soldiers came into view, Ford, what would he do? He executed one of his patented attacks, an all-out attack, and the Federals were routed, retreating all the way down to their fortifications. That was May 13th, 1865, a little over a month from the time of Lee's surrender. So it is some kind of a sort of a consolation prize to us that the last pitched battle of the Civil War was a Confederate victory thanks to Rip Ford, a month after Appomattox. Rip lived in Austin for several years after the war, serving as superintendent of the state deaf and dumb school. From 1879 to 1883, that school is still on its hill. You go down Congress Avenue and past the Colorado River, and there it is. The hill's a little more crowded than it was in his day. And it was an asylum. They were not treated well, and Rip Ford didn't going to have any of that. He turns it into a trade school. The first thing he did was learn sign language himself so that he could communicate with these people. And he turned it into a school of trades, and there is a building there today that is named after him. But in 1880, his 13-year-old son, John William Ford, was showing a pistol. And those old single-action pistols of that era did not have safeties on them. And he was showing the pistol off to some of the boys when it went off. And he shot himself round the knee. Dr. Rip heard that go. He hustled up there. He applied a tourniquet. It looked like the boy was going to be all right, but infection set in. And a month later, his son died at the age of 13, I believe it was. During the last years of his life, Ford moved to San Antonio, where he had married doctors. And they were living, he was an elder statesman there, and they were living in that marvelous King, one of them was a real estate guy, and they were living in that marvelous area of the King William District. And sadly, his oldest daughter, Fanny, died during that period. She was only 54. And finally, in 1897, Rip suffered a stroke, died 1 month later. He is buried in San Antonio's Confederate Cemetery. It's a very impressive gravesite because everybody, Masons and Confederates and everybody else, added some kind of little marker to it. Now, if you'll allow me, I'll just take 1 minute to say a word about the museums I visited. I contacted the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum as soon as I conceived of this project. They said, "Oh no, come on, we need this, and we'll be ready for you." And they had a desk beside, copy machines and all that, ready, and this certificate, marriage certificate that I showed you, and so forth. They have always treated me very well. In Austin, I visited the Texas State Archives. I told you about the 14 Ripford notebooks and various other things. Also, I visited the Heritage Museum at the Texas State Institute for the Deaf. They do have one, and it is managed by one of the graduates of that, a very fine young lady. I visited the Texas Military Museum at Camp Mabry. Not as helpful as they had been in the past. They gave me some guy, one of the Texans, and he didn't know what he was talking about. And then I went to Oakwood Cemetery, where a lady named Jennifer Chenoweth, who was the museum site coordinator, and she took me out to the small Ripford plot with his son and father, and of course his second wife. In St. Augustine, which is only 50 miles from me, I went multiple times. That was where he lived his first decade in Texas. They have an old jail library and museum, and boy, they have digitized that thing. They have local people who run it, know what they're doing, know what they've got, and they had wonderful documents. And then in Brownsville, there is a city museum in Brownsville, one that I visited actually a long time ago. There was a well-to-do merchant right in the middle of town, and they converted his home into a museum. And it's a fine museum. They were very helpful. Also, they had a museum at the First Presbyterian Church, where he got married his third time. And then just outside town, the Palmetto Ranch is a national battlefield site and museum. And they had a great visitor center and walking trails and everything. And it's well worth visiting. So I did have a lot of museum help throughout this project. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you for letting me talk about Rip. I want to tell you something about him. He is the most difficult guy I've ever had a chance to write about, except Sam Houston. Sam Houston was, boy, he was something. He was an interesting guy, and so was Rip. And I hope it's been of interest to you. Thank you for your kind attention.